Welcome back to the CNC3 7 p.m. news. I'm Ryan Bechu. Thank you so much for staying with us. In an extra over of CPL, we're mere hours away from the Caribbean Premier League T20 final. It will be the Trinbago Knight Riders versus the St Lucia Zouks. Both teams eased into the final that will begin at 10 a.m. tomorrow at the Brian Lara Cricket Academy. To welcome some analysis on both semi-finals as well as a look ahead to the final, I want to welcome Ian Bishop to the show, the former West Indies cricketer and now commentator. Bish, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
With these two teams having such an easy road into the final, how difficult is it to analyze who edges ahead, who has the advantage going into tomorrow's final?
Well, first of all, I don't think it was an easy road into the final for both of them. I think that the Zouks have had to do it tough because they haven't really put together what they would term a perfect game. Their batting it's not been on full throttle. It's their bowling and I suppose the tactics and the leadership of Daren Sammy that has gotten them to that final. The batting still has underperformed. TKR have played perhaps the best cricket so far of all the teams from the tournament. They've gotten runs when other teams have struggled, and they've been very efficient with the ball. So if you're looking on form, you'd say TKR has the edge.
Right. Did the St Lucia Zouks surprise you as much as everyone else seems to be surprised that they made it to the final?
In a sense, yes, because on paper, and cricket is played on grass, not paper, but on paper, you would have thought that teams like Ghana, teams like maybe at the start of the tournament, the Jamaica Talawas had more powerful batsmen. Even the Barbados Tridents had more depth in their batting, and their bowling was equally as good. But I think generally the batting in the tournament, TKR apart, batsmen have struggled on pitches that have not always been straightforward, but it cannot be used as an excuse. Even coming into the tournament, the long periods of inactivity is something the players had to deal with. But after you get past 5, 6, or 7 games, you can't use that really as an excuse anymore for some of the batting.
Let's talk about the tournament a little bit, Bish. We've had a series of low scores, including the 2 semi-finals. We saw the Barbados Tridents not bat very well as well. The Patriots had some scores as well under 100. Did the standard of the tournament deplete this year, given everything, given all the circumstances, pandemic, and the fact that these players haven't played for a long time? From your lens, what have you made of it?
Well, you have to factor in the pandemic. There is no doubt about that. When players are coming in out of the cold, literally haven't played for, what was it, 5 months, 6 months, whatever the case was of inactivity, with folks barely even allowed to leave their home for long periods of time, you would expect a high level of rustiness. Some of the teams weren't able to acquire the overseas players that were their first choices. And then they got into this bubble, and there was very little opportunity for them to practice, middle practice, we call it. So there are circumstances mitigating some of the play that we've seen. Some of the pitches have been difficult. You had to adapt on them. They weren't what we call the archetypal T20 pitches. So I give some leeway to the players. But as Andre Russell said, after you've gone 6 or 7 or 8 games, you can't then continue to say, because of these things, that we aren't batting well. So I think the players were challenged, but some of them have not really played smartly.
The Trinbago Knight Riders, unbeaten run, 11 matches heading into the final. Did that sort of surprise you that they went just as well as Guyana Amazon Warriors up to this point last season?
I would say I'm surprised. They've just been complete. And again, it's so far because Guyana Amazon Warriors last season had the cautionary tale, aren't they? You win all your league matches, you win your playoff matches, and then on the biggest stage, you let it slip. So I think TKR are well aware of that. I don't want to predict an outcome because cricket is a very funny game. But I think if you look at the games played so far, TKR have been head and shoulders above the rest of the teams consistently, quality-wise. And they play as a family. They're a very together unit, so kudos to them.
I just wonder, with this momentum that they've built throughout this tournament, if they seem a little bit unstoppable, what would it take for the St Lucia Zouks to stop them in the final?
You used a word there that I don't ever use where cricket is concerned at all, momentum. because if you roll a stone down a hill and you put a brick wall in front of it, it does stop the stone from rolling, doesn't it? So momentum doesn't apply to cricket. The St Lucia Zouks are a very smart team. They're very well coached by Andy Flower. I know Andy is a very meticulous, very well prepared coach, utilizing whatever resources he has. Daren Sammy is a two-time World Cup winning captain. So they are strategizing well. Their bowling matchups are exemplary, where TKR will look and says, we can exploit that Zouks batting with our bowling armory. And similarly for Daren Sammy, if he can get his bowlers to limit that TKR batting, which is an aggressive batting unit, then it's game on.
You mentioned Andy Flower. He was on the show a few weeks ago. He came into this team. This is his first CPL tournament, and he's been having tremendous success with the St Lucia Zouks, taking the team to the final. We can talk about the McCollum-Pollard partnership all we want, but how about that Andy Flower-Daren Sammy partnership for the St Lucia Zouks? That's been really key to their success this season.
Well, it must be tremendous. I'm not in the dressing room. I'm not between the four walls that they build a shelter under. But Andy coached England. He was a big part of the England setup for years. Even as a player, when I played against him, you can see how meticulous he was about his preparation as a player. His stroke play, very precise, and he's brought that into his coaching, and he's a high-level coach. But he couldn't, I don't think, do it without Daren Sammy and Daren's understanding of particularly the local players, what they are capable of, where they fit, how to communicate with them. So I would think there's a synergy there between Daren and Andy Flower that has worked brilliantly. It's not that TKR's coach and captain aren't doing the same thing. But if you look talent-wise, you'd have to say that the Zouks are man for man, not as naturally talented, if there's such a thing, as TKR, but they've done well against the opposition that they've come up against.
Yeah, given the pandemic and travel restrictions and a lot of players not being able to make it into the CPL, was the CPL balanced enough this year, or it was impossible to have it properly balanced, all the teams?
It's impossible. I think, and this is just me speaking, I have no horse in the race. I work on the project. But when you take into consideration all that has gone on in the world and in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, borders are closed, national and international travel is very much depleted and very difficult. I think we should be pretty happy that CPL pushed ahead with this tournament, because what is happening, Ryan, is that it's providing a level of distraction for viewers in Trinidad and Tobago and around the globe with very little cricket being played. It's giving some hope, the way TKR have played, and I've said this before, to a population base that is struggling like everyone else to deal with the pandemic. And I think that's a good thing. People need hope. They need to smile. They need to see something on their phones and televisions that shows excellence. And I think TKR and CPL have provided that for them.
And the IPL is coming up soon. You may very well be traveling to Dubai for the IPL. How much has cricket changed, going forward, Bish, into the next year, 2 years before this pandemic ends?
Well, you're prophesying another 2 years before the pandemic ends.
Let's just say it's because I don't envisage that cricket will return to its new normal very quickly after the pandemic ends.
Well, I don't know if it will be 2 years, Ryan. I'm hoping it's not 2 years, because the costs, for example, of CPL having to provide this bubble, the cost of chartering flights for the CPL, for the West Indies tour to England, for Pakistan's tour to England is significant. The cost of hosting the IPL, significantly more than it would have been otherwise. I don't know that players can afford to be traveling from one bubble to another bubble, series after series. You're talking mental health, you're talking being away from your family and all of that. It is too difficult and challenging to do this over a long-term period. So I do hope and pray that we come up with a solution to this virus and eradicate it.
Yeah, looking ahead to the West Indies playing in the Men's T20 World Cup, hopefully potentially next year. How much of an influence would this CPL have been on the selectors? When you look at players like Mark Dial rising out, and then you have Aki Lucien, who's done so well for the Trinbago Knight Riders, how much do you think this CPL would have helped the selectors?
It would have given the selectors a lot to look at, a lot of what we have and some of what we haven't. And that's where I think you talk about the numerous benefits of the CPL tournament, and I've touched on that before. Now, from a playing point of view, we've gotten to see what Joshua De Silva has or hasn't in T20 cricket. We've seen Ashmead Ned. We've seen Kevin Sinclair. We're seeing inconsistent signs from Nicholas Puran. Mark Dial, you say he had a good game last night. He still has more to do. I think he's shown that potential that we've seen from him occasionally. So we've seen a lot of excellent young bowlers, guys who can field great all-round game. What I haven't seen enough of are young batsmen taking advantage of the opportunity. So it's the experienced heads once again, and it's a very difficult game, to be fair, for young batsmen to come into and dominate.
Before the start of this tournament, Daren Sammy said he still has his eyes set on international cricket, potentially the Men's T20 World Cup. Has he made a case for himself?
That I don't know. You'll have to ask Daren if he's satisfied with the way that he's gone. Performance-wise, with bat and with ball, he's nowhere near where Daren himself wants to be. But Daren, I believe, has a part to play in our cricket going forward, because tactically and from a strategic and motivational point of view, Daren is top class, and we have to be able to utilize all of that experience in some way for West Indies cricket going forward. We need all hands on deck. And a guy who has won 2 T20 World Cups, don't tell me that he hasn't got something to offer. It may not be on the playing field. It may be behind the scenes in our structure somewhere. Has to be used.
BISH, TKR versus Zouks in the final of the CPL T20. What are the factors that will dictate the outcome?
Hunger. TKR and Zouks are two teams that are highly spirited. Talent-wise, you would say that TKR, and the way that they've been consistent, the record shows that skill-wise, they have more skill. But Zouks have heart. They have a lot of heart, and they're very clever with bringing their resources together. So I wouldn't write them off and say they stand no chance. But TKR, with the way that they've played, certainly have their foot on the gas, and they can do great things.
Would the know-how count for anything? TKR having won multiple titles, this is the first time the Zouks will be in a final. Would that count for much?
All of that helps, but it still comes down. You can have all of that, Ryan, but on the day, if you are not as hungry, if you are not as determined, if you are not as smart, then you can slip up. And we've seen it historically across sports that the underdog, and Zouks will come in as the underdog by virtue of the record, the underdog can have their day in the sun. So there is no given. TKR generally have to come out there and play as if their life depends on it. And the same for the St Lucia Zouks as well. They are not happy with just being in the final. They want to win. And I think that's a good thing for CPL, West Indies, and the game in general.
Ian Bishop, 13 years ago, we had a conversation outside the Queen's Park Oval, and because of that conversation, I can sit in this chair tonight. Thank you very much for that conversation and for this interview.
Thank you very much for having me, Ryan, and good to see you sitting in that chair.
Thank you so much. July 27th made it 10 years at CNC3. That brings us to the end of our CNC3 7 p.m. news. Thank you so much for joining us. The final between the Trinbago Knight Riders and the St Lucia Zouks takes place tomorrow from 10 a.m. Trinidad and Tobago time. Remember, you can watch it right here on CNC3 as well as CNC3live.com. Have yourselves a great night.